Welcome to This Week in Local, a Localogy podcast featuring lively conversations about the local digital ecosystem, hosted by Localogy analysts Mike Bolin and Charles Lachlan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Local. I'm Charles Lachlan, your co-host, joined by your other co-host, Mike Bolin. Mike, how's it going?
Hi, Charlie. Doing well.
Great. So this week we're going to change things up a little bit. Mike, you and I part of the onstage crew last week at the L23 conference, Localogy's annual conference. We were in Coronado Bay, California. And despite our best efforts, it was a great event. And for this episode, we thought it would be fun to share a few short pieces of audio from the conference and then talk a little bit about what they mean, where they fit in the broader context of what we cover and so on. So do you want to set up the first clip, Mike? Why don't we get right into it?
Yeah. So the first clip is from Chad Richard, who many of our listeners know is SVP of Biz Dev and Corp Dev at Yelp. And he said something interesting on stage, which is sort of a formidable but yet forgotten topic in the sort of Localogy world, which is the concept of self-serve, SMB self-serving in both account sales and account management. So here is Chad talking about that.
So this sort of digital acceleration of the SMB was pretty well timed for us because in 2019 we were really focused on driving self-serve through SMBs. So on the product side, we had really developed a lot of technology and product experiences to make it really easy for SMB owners to kind of get in there, buy ads, manage ads, see how they're doing, see the results of these decisions they made. And our go-to-market team, we really transitioned to what we called rep-assisted self-serve. And so instead of a Yelp salesperson calling you up and trying to sell Yelp to you, the whole idea was really to get you to log in and buy Yelp yourself and start building that habit once again. And so the timing was actually great for us as we saw more engagement with business owners updating their profile listings and responding to reviews, having them take that next step on the platform where they're buying ads, managing ads. That cohort of advertisers is our best retaining advertisers too. So it's been a really great success story for us. We moved from about 3,000 local sales rep down to about 2,000 local sales reps. So we've dramatically decreased the number of people we have selling. Meanwhile, we've been growing revenue every year as well. So it's been a nice transition.
So interesting quote from Chad. Like I said, sort of a previously prevalent topic in the sort of Localogy, local commerce world. That sort of, I'm not sure if you agree in terms of just anecdotally, it seems like it's kind of died down, but Chad sort of reinvigorated this topic. And to sort of pan back for context, the overall discussion in this panel Chad was sitting on is about the sort of new SMB, right? The evolution of the SMB, the thought being that there's been an evolutionary path for a while, and that's, generational. It's sort of the turnover of SMBs as older ones retire and newer digital natives sort of, take over that same spot on Main Street. That was to some degree COVID accelerated. They're more digital native, all that good stuff. But one thing that came into that, not only they're just sort of like digital affinities, but they're sort of independence, for lack of a better word. They're more inclined to self-serve. And if you think about it, that's really where a lot of companies like Yelp and any sort of local marketing and services providers want to get, right? I mean, the cost of acquisition is obviously lower. Margins are higher when you don't have that sort of that sales expense, again, cost of acquisition. But I think another thing that is interesting that Chad said, not just like the unit economics of just greater margins, but the retention piece. I hadn't thought of that until Chad said that. That was a real sort of light bulb moment for a lot of people at the conference, because it stands to reason. If someone sort of is scratching an itch and like kind of leaning forward and buying something, as opposed to being called and sold on it, that sort of represents a greater need. It's a better demand signal that tends to lead to a more retentive customer. So I thought that was just really interesting from Chad. And that, again, this is something where a lot of folks want to get and have always wanted to get, but it's sort of naturally happening just with that evolution of the SMB sort of savvy and digital independence.
Yeah, I thought this is really interesting too, and he actually shared some numbers, and having 3,000 reps down to 2,000 local reps. This sort of idea of this rep assisted self-serve, which is a bit of an old idea. I mean, I hate to say it's an old idea. I mean, it's an idea we've kind of heard versions of over the years, and it sounds like they've actually implemented this, and it's actually driving down sales headcount, even though they still have a significant sales force. I think still about 2,000 people, and it just gets to that notion of using self-serve to drive greater sales efficiency. And I think that's sort of been the holy grail in local for a long time. And he's actually offering evidence that it's working, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he quantified it. You're absolutely right. They've both sort of reduced the sort of the sales force and increased the sort of go-to-market assisted sale like team. And I'm not sure if that was like a one-to-one.
I don't know.
Actual,
what I gathered from what he said was that there's been a net headcount reduction, but I don't know if that's actually. Yeah. I mean, that's what I got from listening to this. I don't know if that's, those numbers we don't have in front of us, but that's the impression I got, and that it's driving a greater efficiency of sales headcount, and which has been where everyone wants to take this, right? I mean,
now, not only is this just inherently interesting, and the reason we're bringing it up, but for me, this is the call to action. It was sort of like the light bulb that we're going to spend a lot more time sort of seeing others that sell local services, sell local marketing. That's the Thrives of the world. That's a lot of companies. It's the whole agency world, to see if they're actually seeing that too. Like, I want to see if we can detect like a greater trend here. So
I think this is
commitment.
Right. I think this is something we're going to be covering in the near term, kind of taking a look at, well, who else is having experiences like this, and what is their process, and how are they using it, and what are the outcomes? I mean, Chad was very forthcoming, and it's always great when that happens on stage or on a podcast or in whatever format, if somebody shares actual outcomes with some data associated with them. So Mike, why don't we move on to the next clip? This is another one that you wanted to use, so why don't you set it up?
Yeah. So this one comes to us from Joel Headley, who is VP of Product at Rio SEO. He was actually on a panel that you moderated, Charlie, so you were right there as well. And this sort of hits the AI box for us in this particular podcast. It was, of course, as you remember, a huge topic throughout the conference. So, our sort of cross section here wouldn't be complete without at least one AI clip. But I think Joel had a very good point, which you'll hear in a second. And also not just AI, but another sort of buzzworthy topic these days, which is product-led growth. So here's Joel Headley on that topic.
I will tell you, there's a concept of product-led growth, right? Can I put something into the market that will get other people to start buying? And I think OpenAI did this brilliantly with ChatGPT. There was a lot of talk about, is this going to kill Google? They don't care about competing with Google search. What they want is a bunch of vendors to start buying from them. And the way they did it was they created a consumer-grade product that every consumer is now talking about it. And now every business goes, wow, this is top of mind for buyers as a consumer. How are we going to implement that? So they took this idea where Gmail was a consumer product, and how do we turn that into G Suite and a workplace app that took 5 years for Google to implement, and condensed it down into a week by launching a consumer-grade app that now they already had the business model between selling their APIs and selling their content, and they were ready to go immediately. So I think, like, when you think about how you deliver to the market, sometimes betas are appropriate, but sometimes having a really good focused, knowing who your customer is going to be, and despite paying $20 a month or whatever it is, the individual users are not OpenAI's customers.
So, Charlie, his quote is interesting for a few reasons, and I'll take this sort of opportunity for like a shameless back patting, because we've been talking about this for a while on this podcast and in other places, that the business model for companies like OpenAI are this concept of B2B2C. Their direct customer is not the end user. It is the consumer brands of the world. So think of Bank of America, needing to have a chat bot that their customers can then use for various customer service and support functions. And that's not a new concept. I think Joel sort of validated that for us. But what's new, and I think what's interesting about his quote, is they were so brilliant in their sort of product-led growth go-to-market strategy that they sort of seeded the demand for their customer, which is, again, the Bank of Americas of the world, by going like an end run straight to consumers, launching a direct-to-consumer product to sort of seed that demand. Consumers got so amped up on this, and it started this sort of wave that we've all experienced over the last few months, that it shot up the priority list and the product roadmaps of all of those brands. So they sort of they seeded the demand for their own market by doing that end run to the customer, which is sort of diabolically brilliant. So that was what I thought was interesting in terms of just yet another sort of new and an aha moment that I heard at the conference. What do you think, Charlie?
I think the product-led growth angle is interesting, and I think we have talked about that before. And I think it happened so fast and just so dramatically that I'm not sure everyone necessarily saw the product-led angle to it. It was just the uptake was so dramatic and so way past what anyone has experienced in terms of adoption in so much adoption in such a short time, that I think maybe it just kind of blew past people's awareness in some sense. But the idea, get the consumer to basically push the B2B adoption was interesting, and I think very effective. And I think Joel nailed it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, not only I think I used the word diabolical, but it's also like deceptively simple and not necessarily new. I mean, these are just sort of like standard age-old like B-school principles. It's sort of a variation on a lost leader, essentially. Mm-hmm. And he mentioned other examples. Gmail, Google has done it with like all of their free products, and then just kind of then creating an enterprise version. But it's interesting to see it sort of play out in today's version of that. And I think it just holds some interesting lessons for any folks that are working on a go-to-market plan or a product roadmap to consider this sort of,
Well, this will be taught in business schools, but by robot professors in the future.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so why don't we just we'll get into the next thing we wanted to talk about, which is a little bit of a different topic, not a little bit, well, pretty much a completely different topic, and that is kind of the future of work, more broadly speaking. And what we're about to hear is a little clip from Howard Lerman, who spoke on the afternoon of the second day of the conference. Howard's a well-known figure, founder of Yext, left Yext to found a company called Roam, and he offered a very compelling demo of Roam, which he calls the Cloud HQ. It's very much a future of work startup that started up last year, I guess. And, there's a lot of people at the conference who are Roam users, and a lot of them were sort of brought into the demo. That was a little gimmicky, but it worked, I think. And anyway, what we're going to hear is something that was kind of a fun moment of the conference, but it also led to a very serious and interesting response. So after Howard spoke, you were doing a Q&A with him. I kind of stood up and kind of was a little cheeky and asked a question about, he once said remote work sucks. He posted that on LinkedIn. That was like right in the heart of the pandemic. I brought that to his attention. I'm sure he hadn't forgotten about it. And so how do you feel about this now, essentially? And, okay, that was a little snarky on my part, but his answer was actually quite deep, I thought. And let's hear it. Let's roll the tape, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Look, Yext has a really big office downtown in Manhattan. It's very expensive. You can estimate how much we pay in rent because you can see rent showing up as deferred revenue on the balance sheet, which it's a liability on the balance sheet, which you have to do now. It's more than $15 million a year in rent. And so you have this beautiful building in the best area, and you have this free food and great benefits and dinner and all this stuff, and you still can't get people to come back. And then all of a sudden, people start saying, well, can I work from this place or that place? And I initially said no, and I resisted this much like Jamie Dimon to this very day continues to resist this. Now, I just want to be clear, I am not an absolutist when it comes to remote work. I still think companies have to get together. I still think the best collaboration is in person. I just think the reality is, for any company that's more than 10 people, by the time you begin to scale, you're going to be distributed and you're going to have people everywhere. And so you might as well set things up from the get-go in a cloud headquarters than spend $10 million a year on a lease.
Mike, a couple of things jumped out at me from this. One is that he said out loud something many CEOs went through, sort of in this immediate post-pandemic era where they had these gleaming offices. Many of them had multi-year leases, millions of dollars in annual cost. And, they were looking at this in terms of their balance sheet and, in a state of panic, perhaps, or near panic. Most CEOs would not keep their jobs for long if they openly panicked about things, but certainly underneath, deep inside, there was a sense of panic about the cost and how do we deal with this. And he kind of admitted that that's what was his immediate driving his immediate response to the pandemic. And let's get these people back in this fancy office I've built for them and got all this free food and all this stuff. And let's come back to work. Let's come back to the old normal. And then it eventually dawned on him that the old normal is gone. Okay. And, that was a folly. And, even people like Jamie Dimon are fighting this battle unsuccessfully. And so he accepted that the world of work had changed permanently. And he then pivoted, started a company to address what he considered the new normal, which is he calls distributed work, which is basically a combination of in office and out in, your living rooms in Idaho or Florida or wherever you are. And I tend to agree with that. That's kind of is the new world of work, and that the in-office, 100% in-office model is dead. He acknowledges that, and he's building a company around it. I thought the clip encapsulated that in a very candid way. And that's why I thought it was really interesting to share. And it also kind of frames this whole notion that kind of this, I think you used the word remote tech at some point during the conference or in your conversation with Howard. I thought that's a good way to frame this sort of emerging set of technologies that's kind of, for everything from Read AI to Weight Room to Roam and a bunch of others, I'm sure, out there and more to come. It's sort of a new space that we're covering. And Howard was right up there on stage showing it to us.
Yeah, I liked this because it was sort of a refreshing moment of honesty and humanism from a CEO. And when you look at all of those CEOs that were looking at their balance sheets in that era, as you framed up, I think there was none more sort of pronounced than Howard's situation, because they had just bought that building. And I think the word used was glistening or something like this. That building, I'm not sure if you've been there. It is quite impressive. So they just went through this massive investment and then suddenly they couldn't use it.
Right. It was fresher for them perhaps than for others, but many companies went through the same thing.
A lot of people did, exactly. But the other thing I like is Howard's characterization of, and this reflects his evolved thinking. It's no longer about sort of like remote work or at the office or even hybrid. It's sort of a just more nuanced principle, which is what he calls distributed work, right? So it's, even if it's a company that goes fully back to work or doesn't, I mean, every company has a different variation on their particular hybrid model in the post-COVID world. But regardless, it's about having companies that are spread out, whether they're in the office or at home. Nonetheless, they are spread out. And that is what makes Roam, I think, particularly interesting just in terms of its addressable market. I mean, if you're broadening the addressable market to that definition of a distributed workforce, that covers the entire Fortune 500 and beyond. So I like that framing of a distributed workforce. Like, you have a headquarters, you got satellite offices. It has nothing to do with who's working from home or not. No matter what, you're spread out.
Right. No, yeah. And I think he's acknowledging that there's an in-office component to distributed work. It could be 10%, 20%. It could be 3 days a week. It could be 5 days, probably not 5 days a week, but there is an in-office component and a remote component. People call that hybrid. I think hybrid is there's a Venn diagram, and hybrid and distributed overlap significantly, but there is a distinction between the two. And I think it's that wherever you are, you're not in the same place. So you need to find, at least the principle behind Rome is that you need to find a sort of organizing principle around that distributed environment. And
yeah, and we will probably cover this in a different discussion because I think it deserves its own discussion. But I think the UX that he particularly showed really sort of, I think, scratches that itch, and it has sort of a spatial orientation.
Yeah.
Like the screen is literally set up as just different sort of like, I'm in my office, it's
Right.
over here. It's almost like a video game. And to talk to you, I drag my avatar over to your office, and then boom, we're in a meeting. So that's sort of the UX sleekness. And again, that's a different topic to get more granular into the actual product. But I thought that it does scratch that itch for that, distributed workforce. Again, to use the new buzzword.
Yeah.
And yeah, even pre-pandemic, you always had maybe some satellite offices, you had some, traveling sales guys and girls who are on the road. I mean, so I think it's broader than what we normally consider remote work. So I think I'm going to start conditioning myself to use that term instead. And I'm sure Howard will like that.
It works for me. I find that term on point for what do we know anyone we're knowledge workers, I guess best. I like that term about as much as I like the term content creator, but we are knowledge workers. Do you know anyone who's a knowledge worker isn't in something that could easily be described as a distributed work environment?
Yeah,
I don't.
Exactly.
Everyone is. So this is the new normal, and he has found I think the right term for it. And now he's trying to build the operating system for it, essentially. We'll see how well it works. So far, so good, it seems. Anyway, we all know Howard is one of the great pitchmen of all time. So, and he's doing a very masterful job of pitching Rome. And it was a really very compelling demo, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Mike, seems like a good place as any to end this. Why don't you read us out?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, and thanks everyone for listening. This has been This Week in Local. Stay tuned every week for more episodes. You can find the show on all major podcast networks and find out more at localogy.com. Please also subscribe, like, and comment. So I'm Mike Boland with Charles Laughlin. Our producer is Dara Sweat. So thanks for listening, and see you next week.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Localogy's This Week in Local with Mike Boland and Charles Laughlin. Be sure to subscribe for more.